Thank you, Dr. Emmons and Dr. King, for your respective lecture and response, as well as both of your research on gratitude and human flourishing and thriving. It is a privilege to be able to participate in this year's symposium. Today, I'd like to respond to how today's lecture on how I have observed gratitude as a virtue, practice, and even spirit in my own Korean cultural context, as I've collected data over the years from my lived experiences, as well as drawn themes from my clinical work. From Dr. Emma's lecture, we know that gratitude is an important component in shaping the human experience. I feel this is being communicated to us when so many are probably feeling wary from experiencing loss and tragedy, and maybe struggling with the concept of gratitude, especially given the last 2 years. Gratitude helps us acknowledge the goodness or good things in one's life, as well as acknowledge that this benevolence can be found both in and outside of the self. Dr. Emmons further highlighted that Christian gratitude is unique because the acceptance of all good and bad fortune is a form of humility in the face of God's unchanging nature. I find truth in this statement because of the otherworldly quality we see when those who have little to be thankful for according to the world persist in singing praises of gratitude. I believe these are individuals who embody a grateful spirit and have it embedded in the very essence of who they are. Brother Steindl Rast differentiates between a transpersonal gratefulness over personal thankfulness, the latter which occurs more directly between people, but the former one, transpersonal gratefulness, extends beyond the gift, giver, and receiver, and manifests as a deeper overall celebration that something bigger has happened outside of the act of benevolence. This transpersonal gratefulness might even occur in the presence of suffering, which I believe deepens and matures the practice of gratitude. So first, I'd like to use this idea that Christian gratitude is unique as a pivoting point to offer an additional perspective on the relationship between gratitude, suffering, and even lament, and do so from my own particular vantage point. As the eldest daughter of a Korean Presbyterian immigrant pastor, I grew up witnessing a lot of pain in our parishioners. From a young age, I saw some of the elderlies in our churches silently and wistfully longing to be back in their homeland, but staying because their children and grandchildren's home was here in the US. I saw many who held prestigious professions in Korea, but due to language and other cultural barriers, took manual labor jobs that held little meaning for them, and watched the twinkle of pride gradually dim from their eyes. I saw incredibly intelligent and dignified people looked down upon and regarded as less than simply because of their broken English. I heard whispers of marriages crumbling under the stress of adjusting to a new culture, and at times I felt a sad but growing rift between older and younger generations, as one fought to keep tradition alive while the other quickly embraced a new culture. And yet many embodied a grateful spirit despite their pain. One memorable experience I have occurred one morning when my sister and I accompanied my parents to early morning prayer service, which we call 새벽 기도, and we always followed them during school holidays. At the end of these services, my father would dim the sanctuary lights, which signified the start of a sustained prayer time, and there were always a few parishioners who would stay behind and pray. But they weren't silent praying with a few tears and sniffles. They were wailing, the kind of crying that you know came from the depths of their soul. As a child, it felt quite frightening to hear, almost like I wasn't supposed to hear these sounds, but yet this would always last from a few minutes to a few hours. So that morning, on the car ride home, I asked my parents what the adults were wailing about, and the surprising answer that I still remember to this day was this. They said, they're crying out their pain and gratitude to God. That felt really confusing to my young mind because I wondered, how is that even possible? Because when I'm sad, I cry. When I'm happy, I laugh. And when I feel grateful, I say thank you. I experience three separate emotions and three separate responses. So, how can words expressing pain and thanks come out at the same time? And yet, something about that answer felt deeply, deeply satisfying. They had this unworldly, grateful disposition that did not diminish despite their pain. They coexisted and were experienced simultaneously without canceling each other out. In my training, I have often wondered how to sit with my Korean and Asian clients as they express their pain, but also their gratitude at the same time. My supervisor, Dr. Pak, frequently says to me that we have to walk the tightrope and do both and not either or. And while this is usually referencing for people who identify as dual culture or dual identities, I believe this also applies here because humans are such complex beings that can experience a wide range of emotions at any one time. If they're in pain, we mourn with them and help them emotionally process that pain. When they rejoice out of gratefulness to God and other people, we rejoice with them and help them process that as well. We help them process both pain and acknowledge the goodness they've received. Second, Dr. Emmons cited research that carefully explains the difference between gratitude to God and gratitude to people and how both can help us understand ourselves. As believers, gratitude directed towards God reminds us that God, in his benevolence, gives us good gifts that we often do not deserve. In some ways, it shows us that we are indebted to him, for he gives us things that we cannot fully repay. So when we thank God, we demonstrate our dependence upon him to sustain us. And when we feel sustained by his benevolence, we can maybe then find ourselves with increased capacity to give to others through reciprocity. Additionally, in my clinical training, I have seen another way that gratitude toward other people, especially to one's family, can tell us something about how that person understands their identity. For the last 2 years, as I have been learning how to conduct culturally sensitive Korean therapy, and as my supervisor and I have reflected on my clinical work thus far, I kept noticing many of my clients were living with a sense of duty and responsibility to their families and felt indebted to the elders. At times, I felt they were interchanging duty and responsibility and indebtedness with gratitude, but there was no negative connotation. The majority of my clients have been in the young professional age group, and almost all identify as 1.5 to second generation Korean American, which means that they are fairly acculturated to the American culture. Many sought therapy to work on issues such as anxiety, depression, relationship concerns, and difficulties adjusting to the COVID-19 pandemic. But when I really attuned to their narratives, many were living with the sense of duty to their parents to succeed and make something of themselves as a way to show gratitude for their parents' and elders' sacrifice of leaving their homeland for better opportunities for their children and future generations. Influenced by ancient Confucian virtues that valued filial piety or the practice of honoring one's parents and elders, these values were deeply and unconsciously embedded in some of my clients as well, in spite of their acculturation levels. In other words, my clients felt indebted to their parents for their sacrifice, and they were also grateful. Their indebtedness and gratitude were more interrelated than separate. Dr. Emmons titled his lecture today, "You Are What You Think," and I'd like to borrow that phrase to summarize what my Korean clients taught me and are still teaching me today. In their spirit of gratitude towards their parents and elders, my clients demonstrate their view of the self as being more interconnected to others. In other words, in their indebtedness and thankful gratitude to their families and elders, they acknowledge that their individual self is part of one whole collective unit. In their gratitude towards their families, they show us who they are, where they come from, and ultimately demonstrate another way to understand their identity. So with that said, I'd like to end by aligning with Dr. Emmons' statement about the spiritual or cosmic gratitude containing both a vertical and horizontal dimension, orienting a person toward God and towards others. I have also wondered throughout the various stages of my life if gratitude as a practice and virtue and even spirit is yet another way that we can stay interconnected to both God and to others. In a world and during a time that makes us feel paradoxically close and distant to one another simultaneously, in the midst of prolonged suffering and grief, and even amongst all of these different cultural contexts, I like to think our ability to practice gratitude is a gift itself from the Spirit of God to allow us to stay connected to one another and ultimately remember where we come from. Thank you.